When an 85-year-old woman receives a newly declassified file linking her long-lost husband to a secret Cold War mission, everyone around her thinks it must be some bureaucratic mistake. But as she reads further, one startling clue after another confirms what she secretly suspected all along, sending her on a journey across decades and continents to uncover the final truth of the man she married. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you believe in the power of unwavering devotion, hit that like button and subscribe for more. She was born Nina Wilson and took pride in the simple solidity of her name. She grew up in a modest Baltimore row house, where her mother taught piano lessons to neighborhood children, and her father worked at the local shipyard. Even as a girl, Nina dreamed of living a quiet, stable life. She never craved flashy parties or exotic travels. Her favorite afternoons were spent sitting on the old wooden porch with a library book open on her lap, lost in distant worlds while the hum of the city gently passed by. That was her idea of excitement. Stories to read, not necessarily to live. In 1964, her life took a small, thrilling turn when she crossed paths with a man named Edward Grayson. She was 25 then, working as a receptionist in a doctor's office. He was a visitor to the building, tall and neatly dressed, with dark hair that curled just above his collar. She remembered the first time he smiled at her in the waiting room. Something about him seemed both gentle and full of quiet confidence. Later, he asked if she knew of any good diners nearby, and she offered to show him one. Over a lunch of tuna salad sandwiches, they talked about small things: the weather, the best bus routes, how Baltimore's harbor was changing. He said he was new in town, working on agricultural policy for the government, though he never elaborated. She found him charming not for what he revealed, but for the sense that beneath his measured words was a man who observed everything around him. They saw each other twice more, each time at that same diner, each time with the easy comfort of two people discovering they had a bond. He rarely talked about himself beyond mentioning that he traveled frequently to Washington, D.C., for his job. Yet Nina found herself feeling safe with him, trusting that his reticence came from genuine modesty rather than evasiveness. She had met men before who bragged about every minor accomplishment, but Edward was the opposite. When she teased him about having no interesting stories, he gave a soft laugh and said, "I suppose I'll keep my stories tucked away for now." She never pressed. She liked the mystery in him. After only a few months of courting, they decided to marry. Neither of them wanted a grand affair. The wedding took place on a rainy Thursday in mid-April, at a local courthouse near the center of Baltimore. Nina wore a simple dress, white with short sleeves, and carried a small bouquet of daisies. Edward dressed in a gray suit, well-fitted but otherwise unremarkable. Two courthouse employees served as witnesses. Raindrops tapped against the window as they exchanged vows, the overhead fluorescence casting a faint reflection on the tile floor. Despite the minimal surroundings, Nina felt her heart brim with happiness. She was marrying a man who saw her for who she was, who didn't make grand speeches but offered a steady presence. They spent that evening in Nina's small apartment, sharing a dinner of leftover wedding refreshments. There was no big celebration, no elaborate party. Nina was content. She curled up next to Edward on the worn sofa, listening to the patter of rain, reveling in the rare sense of security she'd found. The next day, the sky cleared, and she woke to find Edward in the kitchen, placing a kettle on the stove. He greeted her with a warm smile and a quick kiss on the cheek. They didn't even have a honeymoon planned yet. They were simply happy to be together. 12 days after their wedding, Edward announced he had to leave for a work conference in Washington, D.C. Nina felt a flicker of disappointment. She had imagined they might finally take a short trip or settle into newlywed life without interruptions. But he looked at her with gentle eyes and said, "I'm sorry. This is urgent. I promise I won't be gone long." She walked him to the door, kissed him goodbye, and watched as he carried a single suitcase down the steps to hail a taxi. She told herself it was just a work trip. He had left for short stints before. There was no reason to doubt he would be back by the weekend. Only he never returned. That weekend stretched into the following Monday, then Tuesday. By Wednesday, she was worried. On Thursday, she called the hotel in D.C. that he had supposedly booked. They said there was no record of him. Next, she tried the Department of Agriculture, which he had claimed as his employer. The person on the phone told her they had no record of an Edward Grayson working in their offices. Nina wondered if she was making some silly mistake, maybe referencing the wrong department or the wrong sub-office. She offered the badge number she'd glimpsed once or twice among his papers. But that, too, was invalid. Confusion turned to panic as she was transferred from one official to another, each no help at all. Eventually, her calls went unanswered. The phone would ring and ring. No one ever got back to her. She turned to her family. Her parents were at a loss. Her mother was sympathetic, hugging Nina's shoulders while shaking her head in dismay. Her father, always a pragmatic man, asked pointed questions. How well did you really know him? Nina felt defensive. She might not have known every detail, but she believed in the sincerity of her husband. She refused to entertain the idea that he had deliberately deceived her. As the days became weeks, a swirl of rumors circulated among her acquaintances. Some suggested he might have died, a tragic accident on the road. Others hinted that he might be a con artist who had exploited her for some unknown reason. Nina didn't know what to think, only that her heart ached with the betrayal of being left in the dark. A month after Edward vanished, a man in a gray suit appeared at her doorstep. The day was warm, the sun glaring off the steps. Nina opened the door cautiously. He showed her a badge, but so quickly she couldn't make out the name or agency. He asked if Edward had taken any documents from her apartment or left behind anything suspicious. The tone of his questions implied that Edward had stolen or withheld government materials. She insisted she knew nothing. Then he asked if Edward had ever spoken about Russia, or foreign travel, or any cryptic references to coded messages. Nina felt a surge of anger. She slammed the door in his face, unwilling to indulge further. The man left without protest, leaving her rattled and outraged. Time marched forward, but Nina's longing for answers never faded. She tried to hold on to some semblance of normal life. She returned to her job. She spent weekends with her parents and sister, who urged her to move on. Her sister was the blunt one, claiming that Edward had used her as cover, that he was some sort of international trickster. Nina resisted that narrative, though she had no proof otherwise. She clung to the memory of their wedding day, how genuine he had seemed. A few weeks later, Nina found something startling among Edward's belongings. A passport, brand new, issued in her name but never used. It bore a fresh stamp for Vienna, dated the very weekend he disappeared. The discovery rattled her. Why did she have a passport for a trip she never knew about, to a city she had never mentioned traveling to? She stored it in a shoebox under her bed, unable to decipher its meaning. The sight of it both intrigued and frightened her. It hinted that Edward might have had plans for her, for them, that she never realized. Or perhaps it was evidence that he'd planned to whisk her away, or feed her some lie to keep her safe. She couldn't be sure. All she knew was that, year after year, she would take it out on their anniversary, staring at its unstamped pages save for the mark of Vienna, imagining what might have been. She never remarried. She continued living in Baltimore, moving into her parents' old house after they passed. She tried to find peace, though the question of Edward's fate remained an open wound. Her sister's remark about him having used her stung, but she rarely brought it up. Nina's heartbreak turned inward, a silent sorrow that shaped the rest of her life. She eventually retired from her receptionist work, living quietly, reading old novels, sometimes rummaging through a box of old letters and pictures from that short, joyful month of married life. By 2024, Nina was 85, physically slowed by arthritis in her knees but still sharp of mind. She moved in with her niece, Katie, who worked as a Cold War researcher at the Wilson Center in Washington. Katie was a determined scholar, frequently immersed in newly declassified archives from the 1950s and 60s. She loved her aunt's old stories, though she also sensed the lingering heartbreak in Nina. One evening, Katie came home with a stack of printouts. Her eyes glinted with excitement as she explained that she had been scanning newly released intelligence documents about various Cold War covert missions. She'd spotted something with a partial code name, Operation Greylight, referencing Glassman, Edward, also known as Edward Grayson. Nina felt a chill at the mention of that name. She had lived with decades of uncertainty, and now Katie was telling her there was a file that seemed to match Edward. They sat at the dining table, the lamp casting a circle of light across the documents. One page read, Operation Greylight, Field Asset 1931A, Glassman, Edward. Alias used, Edward Grayson. Last known location, Vienna, 1964. Status, MIA. Reason, compromised. Nina's hand trembled. She recognized the year, 1964, the mention of Vienna. Her eyes filled with tears, a swirl of grief and vindication. She managed to whisper, "He never lied to me about the things that mattered. I knew there had to be more to it." Over the next few days, Katie helped Nina piece together the story. Edward had apparently been a CIA field agent under what they called non-official cover, or NOC. He specialized in infiltration, the kind of espionage that left no official tie to an embassy or consulate. If caught, the U.S. government could deny knowledge of him. Nina began to see how this explained Edward's quiet manner and the swirl of confusion when she tried to locate him. The summary indicated that Edward's mission was to help extract a Soviet biochemist, Dr. Ivan Volkov, who had supposedly developed aerosolized neurotoxins capable of paralyzing entire cities. The plan involved smuggling Volkov out of Vienna, neutral territory, and delivering him safely to the West. Nina's mind reeled at the scope of it all. The man she married had been at the center of a massive Cold War operation, with world-shaking stakes. One of the memos in the file mentioned that the asset, Edward, delayed his exfiltration for 48 hours due to unsanctioned civilian marriage, referencing Nina herself. The language was coldly bureaucratic, describing her as an attachment he should have avoided. Then came a chilling line, recommendation, abort. Nina realized that the CIA had recommended he break off all ties with her to preserve the mission's secrecy. But apparently he hadn't followed that recommendation, because she recalled them actually getting married. He had chosen to take that risk. Then there was another memo, Operation Compromised. Asset believed captured or executed. Civilian spouse unaware of operational significance. Recommend disinformation. That memo confirmed why no one gave her straight answers. They had deemed him lost or dead. For them, it was easier to erase her involvement altogether. She read the words and felt a stabbing mix of anger and sorrow. If only they had told her something, anything, instead of letting her anguish in uncertainty. But that was the nature of clandestine work. Everything was buried under layers of secrecy. Katie, determined to find the full story, kept digging. She scoured digital archives, wrote emails to archivists in Europe, and pored over old references to Vienna. Then she stumbled upon an audio transcript from a disorganized trove of Cold War recordings. The transcript was partially garbled, but one line came through with clarity. "Tell her, I never used the passport. I couldn't risk bringing that danger to her door." Nina froze upon reading that. It had to be Edward speaking. The passport he'd left behind, the one she'd found, had been intended for her. He had clearly decided not to involve her after all, possibly because the mission had become too dangerous. He didn't want to drag her into the crossfire. This short snippet changed everything for her. She realized he hadn't coldly discarded her. He'd taken steps to protect her, even if it meant vanishing from her life. At that point, Nina believed they had reached the end of the trail. The official file declared Edward Grayson or Glassman MIA. No further record existed of him. But Katie refused to accept that final note. She used her professional contacts at the Czech National Archives, suspecting that if Edward had been operating around Vienna, maybe he had surfaced in Prague or some other Eastern Bloc city. Weeks passed with no results, until one day Katie received an excited phone call from her contact in the Czech Republic. They had located a file referencing an American man named Edward Glassman, living in Prague under diplomatic protection from the late 1960s until 1981. Nina's heart nearly stopped at the news. If that man was truly Edward, it meant he had survived the fiasco in 1964 and continued living covertly for another 17 years. This new document also indicated that Edward had protected not only Dr. Volkov, but the scientist's daughter, Lenka, ensuring they both avoided assassination or forced repatriation by the Soviets. He had apparently established a hidden life in Czechoslovakia, still under CIA cover, continuing to shield the defector and his family. Nina read these details with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. On one hand, she was relieved he'd been alive longer than she'd thought, continuing his mission to save others. On the other hand, it meant she had spent all those years alone, believing he might have died while he was out there in the shadows. The knowledge felt like a fresh wound, layered atop the old scar. Nina resolved to find Lenka. She penned a letter in her careful handwriting, explaining who she was, how she had been Edward's wife, and that she only recently learned of his ties to Dr. Volkov and his daughter. She didn't know if the address they had for Lenka was current, or if the letter would even reach her. But she had to try. She ended with a simple line: "He was my husband for 12 days, but in my heart, he stayed my husband for a lifetime." 3 weeks later, Nina received a reply in a neat script. Inside was a photograph that made her gasp. It showed Edward standing in a narrow alley, behind him the faint outline of Prague's old buildings. He looked older than the day he'd left, exhaustion in his eyes, but also warmth. Beside him stood a teenage girl, presumably Lenka. On the back of the photograph, Lenka had written, "He told me about you, every Sunday. He called you his real life. He said he carried your name more carefully than he carried his cover." Nina's tears dripped onto the photograph. This was confirmation that Edward had never forgotten her, that she wasn't just a meaningless footnote in his life as a spy. Lenka's accompanying letter revealed more. She described how Edward had arrived in Prague in late 1964, battered and haunted by a mission gone wrong. He had refused to leave them, Dr. Volkov and his daughter, to face the Soviets alone. He spent years forging documents, negotiating safe passage, always one step ahead of watchers from both East and West. Eventually, Dr. Volkov died in the early 1970s, leaving Lenka alone except for Edward, who remained a father figure to her. She wrote of how he carried a small battered ring with him, presumably Nina's wedding band, that he never parted with, though he never revealed the entire story. Lenka concluded with an invitation. "I think you should meet my daughter. She is your husband's granddaughter in every sense that matters." Katie booked flights for them to travel to Prague. Nina, at 85, was both excited and apprehensive. She had never imagined leaving the United States, especially not so late in life, but she felt compelled to see the city where Edward had spent his final years. They arrived in spring, the weather mild, the city beautiful with its cobblestone streets and centuries-old architecture. Lenka met them at the airport, a woman in her late 50s, her eyes filled with empathy. They embraced without words, tears in both their eyes. For a moment, Nina felt as if she were welcoming family she never knew she had. The next day, Lenka took Nina and Katie to a small cemetery on the outskirts of Prague. They walked among stone markers, some dating back to the 1800s, until they reached a modest grave. The inscription read in Czech, but Lenka translated softly, "Edward Glassman, 1931 to 1981. He saved lives, but lost his own." Nina knelt beside the grave, her hand trembling as she traced the letters. She realized Edward had died 43 years before, while she had still been waiting in Baltimore, wondering if he might return. He'd never truly come home, never been able to share his fate with her. The finality of it overwhelmed her, though it also lifted a weight. She knew now, beyond doubt, that he hadn't betrayed her so much as remained locked in a mission that demanded he sacrifice his personal happiness. Lenka pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed and brittle with age. "He left this for you," she said. "He told me to give it to you if ever we met. It's been unopened all these decades." With trembling fingers, Nina broke the seal. Inside was a short letter in Edward's familiar handwriting, though shaky, as though he'd been ill or under stress. "Nina, they've told me I'll never make it back. I've made peace with that, but not with leaving you. I never used the passport. Couldn't. I wanted to be your husband, not your shadow. I hope you forgave me. I hope you found someone who deserved you, but if not, know this. Every step I took was to protect your name, your face, your future. I'll see you when the air is still and the weight lifts. Edward. The words blurred through Nina's tears. She felt decades of longing and anguish flow through her at once, mingled with a profound sense of release. He had loved her, in his own guarded way, until the end. Before they left the cemetery, Nina carefully placed a small flower at the base of the headstone. She whispered goodbye, though in her heart it wasn't truly a farewell. In a sense, she believed he had never left her side. Katie stood by, quietly supporting her, eyes filled with compassion for this aunt she admired so much. Lenka's expression was solemn, but there was gratitude there too. Gratitude that Nina had come to acknowledge the sacrifices Edward made to keep them all safe. That afternoon, Lenka guided them to a small apartment on the outskirts of Prague, a narrow building with peeling paint. Inside waited a young woman in her 20s. Lenka introduced her as Clara, her daughter. Clara had Edward's smile, a warm, subtle upturn at the corners of her mouth. Nina's breath caught when she noticed that, in certain angles, Clara's eyes mirrored her own shape, a faint reflection of the grandmother she never met. Katie blinked in wonder, seeing how fate had woven these families together across oceans and decades. Clara spoke in polished English. "He was my grandfather. I grew up hearing about him and about you. He said if the day ever came that it was safe, we should find you. I'm glad we finally could." The three women sat for hours in that cozy living room, sharing stories of Edward. Nina told them about the day she first met him, the quiet intelligence in his gaze, how he read volumes of seemingly dull agricultural policy but always had a deeper glint in his eye. Lenka recalled how, in Prague, he insisted on staying behind rather than escaping to the west, all to guard her and Dr. Volkov from the KGB. Clara described how she felt a sense of courage, even though she never met him, simply by hearing the tales of a man who risked everything for people he loved. It was a bittersweet gathering, bridging the gap between the life Edward lost and the legacy he left behind. Eventually, Katie gently reminded Nina that they needed to return to the States. Nina understood. She wasn't as young as she used to be, and traveling took its toll on her body. But before leaving, Nina held Clara's hands and said, "If you ever come to America, my door is open to you. We may not share blood, but we share Edward's heart." Clara smiled, eyes shining, and nodded. It felt like the best resolution they could hope for. A few days later, Nina flew back to Washington with Katie. The journey home felt dreamlike, as if she were drifting between the past and the present. Once in the States, Nina found herself thinking of Edward every morning, but now with a gentler ache. She no longer pictured him dying unknown in a foreign alley. She knew he had lived many years, continuing his mission, protecting a fatherless girl and her father's life's work. That knowledge soothed her. She had a measure of closure, even if it came decades late. Soon after, Nina made one final arrangement. She visited a cemetery near her old Baltimore neighborhood, where she had once reserved a small plot beside a marker that read, "Nina Grayson." It had sat there for years, a quiet reminder of her own mortality. She asked the caretaker if they could update the inscription. Initially, she hadn't known how she wanted to be remembered, but now she did. She had them carve a short line, "Nina Grayson, wife always. He gave me a passport. I gave him my heart." She watched the stonemason etch those words, tears slipping down her cheeks, gratitude mingling with sorrow. That was the legacy she wanted. To claim, publicly, that the man everyone else thought had abandoned her was, in truth, always her husband in spirit. She never remarried, but she didn't remain alone. She had her niece, Katie, who admired her strength, and now she had a distant family in Prague, people who carried Edward's memory forward in their own way. She hoped that, in small acts of kindness, she could honor the sacrifice he made. The rest of her days would not be defined by bitterness, but by the quiet pride that came from loving a man who fought, in secret, to keep others safe. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.